At a luxurious charity gala for a veterans support center, the city's elite are shocked by the entrance of an old, ragged and poor-looking man. He is immediately met with mockery and disdain, especially from the event's organizer. It is then revealed that the old man is no common beggar. He is the Phantom Pianist, a legend who played for soldiers on battlefields, using music to comfort them amid the horror of war. The Aurora Grand Ballroom shimmered with light. Crystal chandeliers dripped golden radiance over 200 of the city's most powerful citizens. Surgeons, bankers, CEOs, and heirs to family fortunes moved through the polished marble hall with champagne glasses in hand. Waiters in crisp uniforms floated between tables, balancing trays stacked with hors d'oeuvres that cost more than most families spent on groceries for a week. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The air was heavy with perfume, laughter, and the comfortable arrogance of people who had never once worried about rent, hunger, or rejection. This was their night, a charity gala for a veterans support center that none of them had ever visited, but all would boast about funding, a noble cause wrapped in luxury. At precisely 8:30, as the orchestra shifted from a light waltz to a sweeping overture, a ripple of unease stirred the crowd. It began at the grand archway, where a shadow lingered. Out of place, unwelcome. The man who stepped forward did not belong. His boots were cracked and covered in dust, leaving faint prints on the marble floor. His army green jacket sagged on narrow shoulders, frayed at the cuffs and thin at the elbows. His hair was gray, unkempt, and his beard was streaked with years of hardship. Gasps scattered like sparks through the hall. Heads turned, pearls were clutched, whispers darted from table to table. "Who let him in here?" hissed a woman in a glittering silver gown. "Security!" barked a man near the front, his voice sharp with outrage. That man was Richard Calloway, tall, handsome in a cruel way, his Italian suit pressed to perfection. The real estate mogul, chair of the gala committee and master of ceremonies. His smirk carried the same weight as a verdict. But the old man's voice cut through the room before security could move. It was low and raspy, yet steady. "Please, may I have a meal?" The laughter came quickly, brittle, cruel. A beggar in a ballroom asking for food. Absurd. But the man didn't flinch. His pale blue eyes scanned the room, not with desperation but with quiet observation, as though he were a soldier surveying foreign terrain. Then he said something stranger still. "I don't ask for charity. Only this. Let me play the piano. One song. For a plate of food." The absurdity drew louder laughter. A concert grand piano, a Fazioli with an ebony finish, worth more than a mansion, sat at the center stage, polished to perfection. The idea that this ragged ghost might touch it was laughable. Richard Calloway leaned back in his chair and roared with laughter. "Play the piano?" he mocked, voice booming across the hall. "You probably don't even know which end to sit at." More laughter followed, each chuckle another lash of ridicule. From near the kitchen doors, Emily Johnson, a young waitress working her second job to pay tuition, froze with a tray in her hands. She wasn't laughing. Something in the old man's eyes reminded her of her grandfather, who had returned from Vietnam with the same haunted dignity. She took a small step toward him, but the hotel manager seized her arm and hissed, "Don't you dare! Do you want to lose your job?" Emily hesitated, torn between her conscience and survival, as the old man faced the storm of scorn alone. Richard rose to his feet, savoring the moment. "Gentlemen, ladies, shall we make this interesting?" He pointed at the stranger with a theatrical flourish. "Play us your song. If you impress me, I'll buy you the most expensive dinner on the menu. But when you fail, and you will, you crawl out the way you came." The ballroom erupted in cheers and cruel wagers. "How many seconds before he gives up?" one man shouted. "5 notes at most," another laughed. "Don't let him touch the keys," squeaked the manager, wringing his hands. "That instrument costs more than his life." But Richard overruled him with a grin. Let him play. We could all use some entertainment. The old man nodded once, his expression unreadable. His name, though no one yet cared to ask, was Samuel Carter. He shuffled forward, each step deliberate. He let his hands tremble as he reached for the piano lid, his calloused fingers stark against the black lacquer. The room buzzed with anticipation, not for beauty, but for humiliation. Yet, as Samuel lowered himself onto the bench, his back straightened slightly. His eyes lingered on the ivory keys, not with uncertainty, but with the reverence of someone staring at an old friend. The crowd fell into silence. Richard smirked, already tasting victory. Well, old man, show us what you've got. Samuel rested his hands over the keyboard. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a slow inhale, he pressed a single note. Middle C. It rang out pure, resonant, impossibly clear, a drop of silver sound that seemed to pierce the very air of the hall. The laughter stopped. And in that fragile silence, Samuel Carter prepared to change everything. For a heartbeat, the ballroom seemed frozen. That single note Samuel Carter had played still echoed in the crystal air, as though it refused to die. It was too clean, too perfect, too deliberate to come from clumsy fingers. Richard Calloway frowned, his smug grin faltering for the briefest moment. He quickly recovered, clapping his hands together. Beginner's luck, he scoffed. Go on then, play us a song. A ripple of laughter followed, though thinner now, tinged with uncertainty. Samuel sat silently, his fingers hovering just above the ivory keys. His back was straight, his face calm, and his eyes did not look like those of a desperate beggar. They were sharp, steady, the eyes of someone who had endured far more than ridicule. Richard took a step closer, unwilling to lose control of the scene. Here's the deal, old man, he declared, projecting his voice across the ballroom. If you can play a song, a real song, not noise, I'll buy you the most expensive meal in the house, but... He paused, savoring the attention. If you fail, you'll be escorted out of here and back to whatever gutter you crawled from. Deal? Murmurs rippled through the audience. Bets were whispered. Someone shouted, I'll wager 100 he can't play 10 notes. Another voice laughed. 5 seconds and he'll break down. Samuel raised his gaze slowly, fixing Richard with a calm stare. And if I succeed? His voice was quiet, but it carried. Richard smirked. If by some miracle you actually impress us, truly impress us, I'll do better than dinner. I'll give you $1,000. Cash. Gasps, laughter, applause. To the men and women in the room, $1,000 was pocket change, less than what they'd tip a valet across a year. But to dangle it as a prize for a homeless man was deliciously cruel. Emily Johnson, standing stiff near the kitchen doors, felt her stomach turn. She couldn't tear her eyes from Samuel's face, but what unsettled her most was not pity. It was the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Samuel lowered his eyes back to the keys. His fingers flexed, relaxed. Then he spoke again, softly but clearly. $1,000 and 1 meal for 1 song. Richard clapped his hands once, sharply. Done! The crowd erupted with approval, the ballroom now transformed into a cruel theater. Heads craned forward. Drinks were forgotten, all eyes fixed on the ragged old man seated at the magnificent Fazioli piano. Samuel closed his eyes. He let his shoulders slump slightly, playing the role they expected. To them he was a relic, a broken man. He wanted them comfortable in their certainty. Then his hands descended. The first chord rose like smoke through the hall, low, resonant, aching with gravity. A hush swept the crowd. The second chord followed. Then a gentle melody unfurled, so simple yet so filled with sorrow that it seemed to tug at the very marrow of those listening. Conversations died instantly. Even the waiters paused mid-step, trays suspended in the air. It wasn't Chopin or Beethoven. It wasn't anything most had heard before. The melody sounded older, rawer, like a soldier's lullaby, A tune carried on wind and memory. A man in the back frowned. "What? What is that?" No one answered. Richard shifted uneasily. He had expected discord, fumbling, embarrassment. But the notes flowing from Samuel's hands were precise, intentional. His use of the pedals, the way he leaned into certain chords, it was mastery, not luck. Whispers began, hushed but frantic. "He's actually good. More than good. Listen to that control." Emily felt tears prick her eyes. The music clawed at something buried deep within her. The memory of her grandfather sitting by the window, staring into nothing, humming a tune only he remembered. Richard straightened his tie, forcing a laugh. "Memorized from the radio," he muttered loudly. "Anyone can fake a tune." But no one laughed with him. Samuel's hands moved faster now, weaving melody and counterpoint together. His fingers blurred across the keys, commanding the piano like a living extension of himself. It was not the performance of an amateur. It was the voice of a man who had lived with music as his only companion in silence, in pain, in war. Gasps escaped the crowd as the music built, swelling into something undeniable. One woman covered her mouth, her diamonds catching the light as tears slipped free. Another man lowered his head, staring at his polished shoes as if ashamed. Emily could no longer hide her tears. They slid freely down her cheeks, her tray trembling in her hands. Samuel's melody climbed higher, faster, then slowed, softening into a gentle close. The final notes hung in the air like fading stars, delicate and haunting. Silence. No one moved. No one dared breathe. And then, the faint sound of someone sobbing. Not Emily this time, but a man in a tuxedo near the front. Samuel lifted his hands from the keys and folded them calmly in his lap. He looked neither triumphant nor desperate. He simply waited, his pale blue eyes resting once more on Richard Calloway. The wager was no longer a game. It was judgment. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The last notes of Samuel Carter's melody seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the chandeliers above. The silence was not the silence of mockery. It was stunned, reverent, and deeply unsettled. Richard Calloway's jaw tightened. His little game had shifted, and he knew it. He had expected a spectacle, something to amuse the guests, not this. Not music that could make a room full of millionaires sit frozen, caught between awe and shame. "Well," Richard said at last, forcing a laugh. It was too loud, too brittle. "A nice little tune. But let's not get carried away. He probably learned that trick in some bar. Nothing remarkable." A few people chuckled weakly, trying to align themselves with Richard's authority, but their voices faltered. The sound felt out of place, disrespectful, after what they had just heard. Samuel's eyes flicked briefly toward him, then back to the keys. His expression was unreadable, calm, waiting. "Play something else," called a voice from the crowd. It belonged to an older man with white hair and a dignified bearing. He leaned forward on his cane, his eyes glistening. "Please, one more." Others murmured in agreement. Richard's smile thinned. He had no intention of letting the spotlight slip from his control. "Enough," he barked. "We've indulged him. This was supposed to be a celebration, not a charity talent show." But even as he spoke, Samuel's fingers moved again. This time the music was different. No longer the gentle lament of before, but something sharper, fiercer. His left hand struck chords like thunder rolling across distant hills, while his right hand danced a melody of defiance, urgent and alive. The room stilled again, every ear straining to follow. The piece rose like a storm, building strength with every measure. Emily Johnson clutched her tray to her chest, her tears renewed. The music wasn't just sound, it was feeling itself, laid bare. It spoke of loss, of battles unseen, of promises broken and still kept. It carried the weight of sacrifice, yet the fire of survival. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some wept quietly, others sat rigid, unsure why the music unsettled them so deeply. Richard's face flushed. He could feel the tide turning, slipping beyond his grasp. The crowd was no longer laughing with him, no longer waiting for the old man's humiliation. They were listening, truly listening, and that terrified him. "Enough!" he snapped again, stepping forward. Samuel finally turned his gaze back to him, calm but piercing. His voice when he spoke was quiet, measured. "You asked me to prove my worth. Tell me, Mr. Calloway, what is it that makes a man valuable?" The question rippled through the room. Eyes turned from Samuel to Richard. Richard swallowed hard, then forced a smirk. "Success," he spat. "Wealth, achievement. Those are the marks of value, not poverty, not failure. Stop this nonsense right now." But Samuel didn't stop. His hands blurred over the keys, pulling from the piano a torrent of sound so powerful it drowned Richard's voice. It was no longer entertainment. It was a declaration. Each note carried authority greater than any title or fortune in that room. When the climax finally crashed, Samuel slowed, softening the storm into a whisper. A final chord trembled, then faded into silence once more. The ballroom erupted, not with applause but with stunned breaths, murmurs, and the unmistakable sound of sobbing. Men in tuxedos wiped their eyes discreetly. Women who had earlier sneered now stared at the pianist with faces pale from revelation. The older man with the cane stood shakily, clapping once, twice, then again with conviction. Others followed, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the applause filled the hall like a wave. Richard didn't clap. His face was taut with rage. Samuel tilted his head slightly, studying him as though examining a cracked mask. His reply was simple. "And what of sacrifice?" The words struck like a hammer. Murmurs spread again, heavier this time. The weight of the question hung over the room like smoke. Emily's chest tightened. She knew instinctively that Samuel was not speaking in riddles. He was speaking from truth, from a past written into every line of his weathered face. Richard opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came. His authority, the power he wielded with money and disdain, was slipping through his fingers. The crowd was no longer on his side. Samuel turned back to the piano, his fingers brushing the keys lightly, almost tenderly. "One more," he said softly. "Then I'll eat." No one dared stop him. And as the first delicate notes of a new song filled the hall, it became clear to everyone that this was no beggar at a piano. This was someone, far greater. The first notes of Samuel Carter's third song floated into the air like fragile strands of light. Unlike the storm that had come before, this melody was delicate, almost fragile, a whisper in the vastness of the Aurora Grand Ballroom. It was a piece of memory. The kind of music played not for audiences, but for ghosts. Each note carried a tenderness that made even the most hardened guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. The waiters stood frozen, trays balanced in their hands, eyes fixed on the piano. The violinist from the orchestra, his bow suspended mid-air, watched in silent awe. The chandeliers glittered above, but the real light now came from the music itself. Samuel's hands moved slowly, deliberately, caressing the keys. His eyes were closed, his head bowed slightly, as though the piano were a confessional and every chord an unspoken truth. The crowd had stopped murmuring. The applause from the last performance had died away, replaced by an almost sacred stillness. All that remained was the sound of music and the heavy thrum of hearts rediscovering something long forgotten. In the corner, Emily Johnson pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears slid freely down her cheeks, unchecked. She wasn't alone. A woman who had earlier sneered at Samuel's dusty boots now wiped her eyes with the back of a jeweled hand. A man who had laughed the loudest at the idea of a beggar touching the piano now sat hunched, staring at the floor, ashamed. The music bypassed wealth, titles, and pride. It spoke directly to the soul. And the souls in that room were trembling. Richard Calloway could feel his power slipping like sand through his fingers. He had built his empire on control. Control of land, of people, of appearances. But here, in this glittering ballroom, a ragged old man was dismantling his authority note by note. His jaw clenched as he looked around. Too many eyes were wet with tears. Too many faces softened with awe. He could feel the shift. The crowd no longer looked to him for cues, for laughter, for approval. Their allegiance was slipping toward Samuel. He slammed his hand against the table. "Enough!" The cry was sharp, desperate. But the music continued, flowing like water around a stone. The room ignored him. Richard rose to his feet. "This is a farce," his voice cracked with anger. "He's manipulating you. It's a cheap trick, sad songs to stir weak hearts. Don't be fooled." But his words felt hollow, brittle against the strength of the melody filling the hall. Samuel's fingers danced faster now, the music swelling into something richer, more profound. The tenderness remained, but underneath it pulsed defiance, courage, and truth. It was as though the piano itself had chosen sides, refusing to let Richard's bitterness drown out its voice. The crowd leaned forward collectively, drawn into the current. Tears streamed freely now. Guests clutched each other's hands without realizing it, their defenses crumbling. Richard's face flushed red. He could feel his authority collapsing, and panic clawed at his chest. He turned toward the security guards posted by the doors. "Stop him!" he barked. "Get him out of here now." The guards hesitated. Their orders were clear: and protect the guests, maintain order. But this was different. They had been listening too, their hard faces softened by the music. One shifted uncomfortably, then shook his head. "No, sir," the taller one said quietly. Richard's eyes widened. "What did you say?" The guard's voice was steady. "He's not hurting anyone. He's playing." Gasps rippled through the room, not at Samuel this time, but at the sight of authority itself buckling. Samuel's song reached its peak then, a soaring, aching high that carried every ear with it. It was not a plea. It was not a performance. It was a judgment, a reminder that truth did not belong to wealth or power, but to those who had suffered and endured. When the final notes fell into silence, the room remained suspended in reverence. No one moved. No one breathed. Then from the front row, the older man with the cane rose shakily to his feet. His voice was hoarse but clear. "My God," he whispered, "this man is no beggar." The room erupted in murmurs, voices hushed but electric with revelation. All eyes turned back to Samuel Carter, still seated calmly at the piano. His hands rested gently on his lap, his face composed, but his eyes, pale blue, unwavering, burned with quiet fire. And Richard Calloway, for the first time in his life, felt truly afraid. The silence after Samuel Carter's final chord stretched on, deep and unbroken. The Aurora Grand Ballroom, once filled with laughter and arrogance, now felt like a cathedral. 200 people sat captive to a truth they couldn't yet name, their hearts cracked open by a stranger's hands on ivory keys. Then the sound came, soft, almost embarrassed at first. A sob, not from Emily Johnson, though her cheeks were wet, but from a man in the front row. He pressed a hand to his mouth as though horrified that such weakness had escaped him. But it was too late. More followed. A woman with diamonds on her wrists wept openly. A judge known for his stoic reserve lowered his head, shoulders trembling. The music had pulled something raw and vulnerable from them all. Emily didn't try to hide her tears. She let them fall freely, her chest aching as though Samuel's song had reached inside and stirred grief she thought long buried. Grief for her grandfather, for promises never kept, for wounds that never healed. Richard Calloway stood stiffly near the stage, his face pale, his fists clenched. He saw it happening, the impossible wager crumbling around him. The bet had been clear. If the old man could make even one person cry, he would earn $1,000. Now, not just one, but dozens sat weeping in front of him. "No," Richard muttered, shaking his head as though denial could rewrite reality. "No, this isn't real." Samuel lifted his eyes from the piano, meeting Richard's glare with calm intensity. His voice when he spoke was steady, even gentle. "You made a bargain, Mr. Calloway, and you've lost." Gasps spread through the hall like wind over grass. All eyes snapped to Richard. Richard forced a laugh, sharp and humorless. "Don't flatter yourself, old man. A few sentimental souls doesn't make you a genius. You manipulated them with sad stories and sound. Nothing more. But even as he spoke, the weakness in his voice betrayed him. His usual certainty, the power of his money, his status, was unraveling in the face of something he couldn't control. Samuel rose slowly from the bench. The slump of weariness that had marked his posture earlier was gone. He stood taller now, his shoulders squared, his spine straight. For the first time, the ragged jacket and scuffed boots seemed not like symbols of failure, but like the uniform of someone who had endured. He let his gaze sweep across the crowd. "You all listened," he said softly. "But did you hear what the music was saying?" The room leaned in as one, caught between shame and reverence. "That first song," Samuel continued, "was a promise, a melody taught to me by a friend who never made it home. He asked me to keep it alive. Tonight I played it for him." Whispers rippled through the guests, each one heavy with realization. "The second," Samuel went on, his voice steady, "was born of defiance. It was for every man and woman who ever stood against cruelty and refused to bow. It was for those who sacrificed, not for wealth or applause, but because it was right." The older man with the cane clutched the handle tighter, tears streaking down his face. "I know that sound," he whispered. "I heard it once, long ago." Samuel's pale blue eyes locked onto Richard again. "And the last," he said quietly, "was for peace, for the silence after the storm, for the memories of what we lost, and the hope that something good might still remain." The crowd sat transfixed, unable to look away. Richard's voice cracked as he shouted, "You're nothing, a beggar with parlor tricks. You don't belong here." But the outburst fell flat. The audience no longer belonged to Richard. They belonged to Samuel, to the truth his music had carved into their hearts. The older man with the cane pushed himself to his feet, his voice trembling but clear. "Who are you?" he asked. No ordinary man plays like that. No ordinary man carries that kind of sorrow. All eyes turned back to Samuel. He hesitated just for a moment. Then his lips curved into the faintest, saddest smile. "My name," he said softly, "is Samuel Carter. But once, a long time ago, they called me something else." The room held its breath. "They called me the Phantom Pianist." Gasps erupted. The name carried weight, a legend whispered in military histories, a soldier who had played broken pianos in war zones, whose music had carried men through terror and despair. Emily's heart thundered in her chest. She remembered the stories her grandfather told late at night, about a pianist who could make soldiers weep even in the mud of battlefields. She had thought they were myths. But the myth stood before her now, alive, breathing, real. And Richard Calloway, pale and trembling, realized he had just mocked a living legend. The silence after Samuel Carter's final chord stretched on, deep and unbroken. The Aurora Grand Ballroom, once filled with laughter and arrogance, now felt like a cathedral. 200 people sat captive to a truth they couldn't yet name, their hearts cracked open by a stranger's hands on ivory keys. Then the sound came, soft, almost embarrassed at first. A sob, not from Emily Johnson, though her cheeks were wet, but from a man in the front row. He pressed a hand to his mouth as though horrified that such weakness had escaped him. But it was too late. More followed. A woman with diamonds on her wrists wept openly. A judge known for his stoic reserve lowered his head, shoulders trembling. The music had pulled something raw and vulnerable from them all. Emily didn't try to hide her tears. She let them fall freely, her chest aching as though Samuel's song had reached inside and stirred grief she thought long buried. Grief for her grandfather, for promises never kept, for wounds that never healed. Richard Calloway stood stiffly near the stage, his face pale, his fists clenched. He saw it happening. The impossible wager crumbling around him. The bet had been clear. If the old man could make even one person cry, he would earn $1,000. Now, not just one, but dozens sat weeping in front of him. "No," Richard muttered, shaking his head as though denial could rewrite reality. "No, this isn't real. Samuel lifted his eyes from the piano, meeting Richard's glare with calm intensity. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, even gentle. "You made a bargain, Mr. Calloway, and you've lost." Gasps spread through the hall like wind over grass. All eyes snapped to Richard. Richard forced a laugh, sharp and humorless. "Don't flatter yourself, old man. A few sentimental souls doesn't make you a genius. You manipulated them with sad stories in sound, nothing more." But even as he spoke, the weakness in his voice betrayed him. His usual certainty, the power of his money, his status, was unraveling in the face of something he couldn't control. Samuel rose slowly from the bench. The slump of weariness that had marked his posture earlier was gone. He stood taller now, his shoulders squared, his spine straight. For the first time, the ragged jacket and scuffed boots seemed not like symbols of failure, but like the uniform of someone who had endured. He let his gaze sweep across the crowd. "You all listened," he said softly. "But did you hear what the music was saying?" The room leaned in as one, caught between shame and reverence. "That first song," Samuel continued, "was a promise, a melody taught to me by a friend who never made it home. He asked me to keep it alive. Tonight I played it for him." Whispers rippled through the guests, each one heavy with realization. "The second," Samuel went on, his voice steady, "was born of defiance. It was for every man and woman who ever stood against cruelty and refused to bow. It was for those who sacrificed, not for wealth or applause, but because it was right." The older man with the cane clutched the handle tighter, tears streaking down his face. "I know that sound," he whispered. "I heard it once, long ago." Samuel's pale blue eyes locked onto Richard again. "And the last," he said quietly, "was for peace, for the silence after the storm, for the memories of what we lost, and the hope that something good might still remain." The crowd sat transfixed, unable to look away. Richard's voice cracked as he shouted, "You're nothing, a beggar with parlor tricks. You don't belong here." But the outburst fell flat. The audience no longer belonged to Richard. They belonged to Samuel, to the truth his music had carved into their hearts. The older man with the cane pushed himself to his feet, his voice trembling but clear. "Who are you?" he asked. No ordinary man plays like that. No ordinary man carries that kind of sorrow. All eyes turned back to Samuel. He hesitated just for a moment. Then his lips curved into the faintest, saddest smile. "My name," he said softly, "is Samuel Carter. But once, a long time ago, they called me something else." The room held its breath. "They called me the Phantom Pianist." Gasps erupted. The name carried weight, a legend whispered in military histories, a soldier who had played broken pianos in war zones, whose music had carried men through terror and despair. Emily's heart thundered in her chest. She remembered the stories her grandfather told late at night, about a pianist who could make soldiers weep even in the mud of battlefields. She had thought they were myths. But the myth stood before her now, alive, breathing, real. And Richard Calloway, pale and trembling, realized he had just mocked a living legend. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped in disbelief, awe, and shock. The Phantom Pianist. The name rang like a bell, echoing through memory and rumor. Stories long buried resurfaced. A young soldier in war-torn Europe who had found broken pianos in ruined churches, who played while bombs fell, whose music had kept men sane in the darkest nights. Some said he had died in battle, others that he had vanished into obscurity. But all agreed he was more myth than man, and now he was standing in front of them. Emily Johnson pressed both hands to her lips, her tears unstoppable. "It's him. It's really him." Across the room, the older man with the cane was trembling. His name was Thomas Whitaker, a retired steel magnate and longtime patron of the arts. His voice cracked as he spoke. I remember hearing of him. They said his music could cut through despair itself. My God." He looked at Samuel with reverence, his old eyes shining. "You're alive." Samuel Carter inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a truth but not reveling in it. "Alive," he said softly, "but not untouched." The crowd leaned forward, breathless. Only Richard Calloway resisted the tide. His face was pale, his jaw locked. He slammed his palm onto the table. "No," he snapped, his voice high, strained. "This is a trick, a con." He read about this so-called legend in some book, and decided to play dress-up for free food. "Do you really believe this?" He jabbed a finger toward Samuel. "This beggar is a hero?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at Richard, others at Samuel, but no one joined in his anger. Samuel's eyes fixed on Richard. Calm, unflinching. "You doubt me, Mr. Calloway. That is your right." Richard seized the lifeline. "Exactly. Anyone can tell stories. Anyone can pretend." His voice grew louder, desperate to reclaim control. "Prove it, old man. Tell us something only he would know." Samuel was silent for a long moment. The air in the ballroom grew heavy, expectant. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Outside the village of Saint-Laurent, December 1944. The snow was red with blood. We had no reinforcements, no hope. Someone dragged out a half-broken upright from a ruined cafe. I played a hymn. Men who hadn't spoken in days sang through their tears. When the shells started again, half of them never rose. The other half said the song gave them enough strength to fight until dawn. The room went deathly quiet. An elderly guest at one of the side tables gasped, her hand trembling. "My husband. He told me that story. He was there. He never forgot it." More whispers swelled. Guests who had family ties to the war exchanged glances, memories rushing back. Richard faltered, but pride still held his tongue. "Coincidence," he spat. "He's a liar, a parasite." Samuel took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Richard's. His voice hardened, iron beneath velvet. "You speak of parasites, Mr. Calloway? I wonder. What have you sacrificed? What have you given besides orders to bulldoze homes and displace the poor so you can build another monument to your wealth?" A murmur swept the crowd. Everyone knew Richard's reputation, but no one had dared voice it so plainly until now. Richard's face turned crimson. "How dare you? How dare I?" Samuel's voice rose, no longer soft but commanding, filled with a soldier's authority. "I buried friends at 19. I called artillery on my own position at 20 because it was the only way to save the rest of my company. I spent 3 years in a prison camp where the only thing they couldn't steal from us was the music we hummed in the dark. And you," his finger pointed like a spear, "you mock sacrifice because you have never made one." The words thundered through the ballroom, gasps, nods, shame. Richard's bluster collapsed, his lips opened, closed, but no sound came. The crowd's eyes turned from him, their allegiance broken. He was no longer their leader, but their embarrassment. Samuel turned from Richard, his voice softening once more. "I did not come here for applause, or for pity. I came to see truth revealed, and tonight, truth plays louder than arrogance." The guests erupted into applause, not polite, but raw, sincere. Some stood, others wept openly. Emily clapped with trembling hands, her face radiant through her tears. And Richard Calloway, once untouchable, stood alone in the glare of the chandeliers, stripped of his power, his mask shattered. Applause thundered through the Aurora Grand Ballroom, echoing against the marble walls, rising higher than the chandeliers themselves. But it wasn't for Richard Calloway. It was for the ragged stranger who had sat at the piano and, with nothing but music, peeled back the layers of arrogance and pride. Samuel Carter stood still, shoulders square, his pale blue eyes calm in the storm of sound. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply let the applause wash over him like a tide he neither sought nor needed. Richard's fists shook at his sides. His voice, when it finally broke through, was hoarse with fury. "This is madness, do you not see? He's a fraud, a con artist in rags. You're all being played." The applause faltered, but only slightly. The guests turned their attention back to Samuel, not Richard. Samuel raised his hand gently and the hall quieted. His voice was steady, deliberate. "I did not come here tonight by accident. I came with purpose." A hush fell over the crowd. Even Richard's protest stilled. "For months," Samuel continued, "you have spoken of an anonymous benefactor, the one who made this night possible. $5 million given to build a new veterans center. Money that has paid for this food, this music, these walls of glass and stone." Murmurs erupted instantly. Guests glanced at one another, startled. They all knew the rumor, but none knew the truth. Samuel let the whispers settle before he spoke again. "That benefactor is me." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause could have been. Emily Johnson felt her knees weaken. She clutched the tray in her hands, her heart hammering. Him? The man they mocked? Richard staggered back a step, his face blanching. "No," he breathed. "You lie." Samuel turned his gaze on him, sharp as a blade. "Do I?" He reached into his tattered coat and drew out a folded document, a copy of the wire transfer, notarized, unmistakable. He held it high so all could see. The emblem of a major bank shimmered under the ballroom lights. Gasps echoed. Even the hotel manager leaned forward, squinting at the paper. Thomas Whitaker, the older man with the cane, pressed a hand to his chest. "It's true," he whispered. "He really did." His voice broke. "My God, he saved this project." The room buzzed, voices rising in astonishment. Richard's rage boiled over. "This is a trick," he shouted, his words frantic. "A pathetic stunt. You staged this, all of it. You dress as a beggar, worm your way in here, and now you expect us to believe you're some hero and benefactor?" Samuel's gaze never wavered. He stepped closer, his presence commanding, his voice low but cutting. "I expected nothing. I wanted only to see if the men and women trusted with this cause were worthy of it." His eyes locked on Richard's, unblinking. "And now I know the truth." The crowd shifted again, their gazes turning toward Richard. Whispers grew sharper, condemning, judgmental. The tide had turned fully, and Richard was drowning in it. "You speak of worth," Samuel said, his voice ringing. "You said value was measured in wealth, in success, in titles. Tonight you revealed your heart, you mocked sacrifice, you spat on compassion, and yet you call yourself fit to lead this cause?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded. The shame on faces, once laughing at Samuel, was now directed at Richard. Emily's chest swelled with a fierce pride she couldn't explain. For once, the powerful were being held accountable, not by other elites, but by a man they had dismissed as worthless. Richard's hands shook as he looked around the room, desperate for an ally. But there were none. The guests who had once laughed with him now turned away. Even the security guards stood still, their faces unreadable. Samuel's voice softened, though it carried to every corner of the hall. "Mr. Calloway, you are unworthy of this responsibility. Effective immediately, you are removed as chairman of the fundraising committee. You will have no further role in the Veterans Center." Richard's face twisted, his lips trembling with rage. "You can't." But Samuel cut him off with the weight of truth. "I already have," gasps, then silence. The verdict was final, and everyone in that hall knew it. Richard Calloway stood frozen, humiliated, his empire of arrogance collapsing under the weight of a single man's authority. A man he had mocked as a beggar. And Samuel Carter, legend reborn, had only just begun to reshape the night. Richard Calloway stood paralyzed, his expensive suit drenched in sweat, his world unraveling in front of 200 witnesses. For years he had been the untouchable authority in this city's elite circles, but tonight a man in rags had stripped him bare. Samuel Carter didn't gloat. He didn't even look at Richard anymore. Instead, he turned to face the rest of the room, his presence calm but commanding. "You wonder why I came here like this," he said, his voice steady. "Why I chose to walk into this hall in rags, asking only for a meal. No one dared answer. The silence was total. Samuel continued, "Because I needed to know the truth. I needed to see if those entrusted with the care of veterans, men and women who gave everything and returned with nothing, could look at one of them and see more than a burden." His words cut like glass. Dozens of eyes fell to the floor, ashamed. "I came to test you," Samuel said, "to see if compassion still lives in these walls, or if it has been bought and sold like everything else." Emily Johnson's throat tightened. She remembered the moment she'd tried to step forward, to help him before the manager stopped her. She felt exposed, but also vindicated. He had seen her. Samuel scanned the room, his pale blue eyes searching, measuring. "What I found was mixed." His gaze lingered briefly on Emily, and for the first time that night, his lips curved into the faintest smile. "But what I saw most," he went on, his voice hardening, "was arrogance, cruelty, and a man who turned another's hunger into a game for amusement." Richard flinched. Samuel's voice rose, not in anger, but in solemn power. "Is this who you are? Men and women who write checks for charity, but mock the very people those checks are meant to serve?" The ballroom was suffocating with shame. Perfumed guests shifted in their seats. Diamond necklaces glittered against trembling hands, and no one dared to meet Samuel's gaze. Thomas Whitaker, the older man with the cane, finally spoke, his voice heavy with reverence. "Mr. Carter, or should I say, Phantom Pianist, why give so much? Why $5 million to a city you could have abandoned forever?" Samuel's eyes softened. "Because I made a promise." The crowd leaned in. "In the war," Samuel said, his voice quieter now, "I played for men who would not live to see morning. I watched them die with music still in their ears. One of them, a boy no older than 20, made me swear that if I survived, I would take care of those who came after us, those who would fight, bleed, and return to a world that forgot them." He paused, his eyes distant, as though seeing ghosts in the glittering hall. "I could not save him, but I could keep my word." A lump rose in Emily's throat. She wiped at her tears, but they kept falling. Samuel drew a deep breath. "So I built a life, quietly, businesses, investments, enough to help if used wisely. And when I heard of this city's plan to build a veterans center, I gave what I could." He lifted his chin slightly. "But money is not enough. Leadership matters, character matters, and tonight, I needed to know if those holding the reins were worthy." His gaze snapped back to Richard, who stood trembling, humiliated. "And now we all know the answer." The guests murmured in agreement, their whispers growing sharper, more condemning. Richard's reputation was crumbling before his eyes. Samuel turned back to the crowd, his tone softening once more. "But I also saw hope. I saw courage, in small acts, in quiet moments, even here." He lifted a hand, pointing gently toward Emily at the back of the hall. Emily froze, her face flushed, her tray clutched tightly in her trembling hands. "This young woman," Samuel said, "was the only one who moved to help me when I was mocked. She saw not a beggar, but a man. That kind of heart," his voice warmed, "is what this cause needs." Gasps spread again. Emily's lips parted, but no words came. She stood rooted to the spot, overwhelmed. Samuel let the silence stretch, then spoke once more, each word deliberate. "The Veterans Center will not be built on arrogance. It will be built on compassion, on truth, on people who remember that sacrifice is more valuable than wealth." The applause that followed was not thunderous this time, but steady, sincere. A ripple of respect that grew stronger with every hand that joined. And Richard Calloway, standing alone in his disgrace, realized the one thing he had never truly possessed, the respect of others. The applause swelled in the Aurora Grand Ballroom, steady and reverent. Guests who had entered the night smug and untouchable were now humbled, their eyes fixed on Samuel Carter, the man they had scorned, who had turned their arrogance into ash with nothing more than music and truth. Samuel waited for the sound to fade before he spoke again. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of a verdict. "Mr. Calloway," he said, turning his gaze back to Richard, "you are finished here." The words landed like hammer blows. Murmurs rippled across the room, agreement rolling like a tide. Richard's face contorted. "You can't do this," he snapped, his voice trembling with desperation. "I built this gala. I organized every dollar raised tonight." "You built nothing," Samuel replied evenly. "You collected checks from men and women eager to polish their reputations, while mocking the very people this money was meant to serve. That is not leadership. That is rot." Gasps echoed. The sting of truth left Richard reeling. He searched the faces in the crowd for support, old allies, wealthy friends. But none would meet his eyes. They turned away, ashamed or unwilling to be tied to him. Thomas Whitaker leaned on his cane, his voice rising firm and clear. "Samuel Carter is right. Calloway has disgraced this cause. He must step down. Tonight." The audience erupted in agreement, nods and whispers of yes, yes, spreading like wildfire. Richard stumbled backward, pale and sweating, a man stripped of every illusion of power. He opened his mouth to argue again, but his voice cracked, and no sound came. Samuel didn't look at him again. Instead, he turned toward the back of the room. "Emily Johnson," he called softly. Emily froze. Every head in the hall turned to her. She felt her knees wobble as the tray in her hands shook violently. Her cheeks burned as she stepped forward, each step heavier than the last, until she stood just in front of the piano facing Samuel. Her voice trembled. "Yes, sir?" Samuel's expression softened. For the first time that night, there was warmth in his eyes. "You showed courage when no one else did. You moved to help when everyone else laughed. That kind of character cannot be taught. It must be lived." Emily's throat tightened. She could barely breathe, let alone speak. Samuel continued, his words deliberate. "You told me earlier you were studying social work." She nodded, barely able to find her voice. "Yes, sir." "Then let me honor that," Samuel said. "As of tomorrow, your tuition is paid in full, your debts erased. You will finish your studies without fear of money." Gasps erupted once more. Emily's hands flew to her mouth. Tears blurred her vision. I can't accept that." "You can," Samuel interrupted gently. "And you will, because when you graduate, I would ask that you take a position at the new Veterans Center, as Director of Community Outreach." Emily's breath caught. She felt the room spin around her. "Director?" she whispered. Samuel smiled faintly. "Yes. You will be the voice for those who have none. You will be the heart this project needs." Emily burst into tears, unable to hold them back. The crowd erupted into applause, louder and more heartfelt than before. People rose to their feet, some clapped with tears in their eyes, others simply nodded, moved by the justice of the moment. Samuel turned next to Thomas Whitaker. His tone shifted, firm and respectful. "Mr. Whitaker, I saw in you tonight not mockery but respect. When others doubted, you believed. I ask you to take the chairmanship of the Veterans Center Committee." The old man's eyes filled with tears. He straightened as much as his frail body would allow and bowed his head. "It would be the greatest honor of my life." Applause filled the hall again. Richard Calloway stood frozen, humiliated, forgotten in the swell of celebration. His empire of arrogance had collapsed, not with lawsuits or scandals, but with a song, and a truth he could never fight. Samuel looked once more across the room, his voice steady. "Tonight you saw a man in rags, and you judged him worthless. You saw a man in a fine suit, and you followed him. Both were deceits, remember this. True worth is not measured by wealth or appearance, but by the character of a soul, and it is often found where you least expect it." The room was silent again, every word sinking deep into hearts that would never forget. And in that silence, Richard Calloway slipped toward the door, his shoulders slumped, his legacy shattered. Spring sunlight poured across the front steps of the brand-new Samuel Carter Veterans Center, a building of glass and stone that gleamed like a promise. The crowd gathered outside was smaller than the glittering gala months ago, but far more genuine. Veterans in worn jackets, families carrying flowers, children holding tiny flags. They filled the air with warmth that money could never buy. Emily Johnson stood near the entrance, dressed not in her waitress uniform, but in a simple navy suit. A pin on her lapel read, Director of Community Outreach. She still found it hard to believe the words were real. Each day at the center had been a whirlwind of planning, hiring, and preparing programs. But today wasn't about her. It was about the dream that had finally taken shape. Thomas Whitaker stood proudly beside her, steadier now with his cane, his voice carrying authority as chairman of the center's board. He had thrown himself into the project with renewed vigor, his wealth finally serving something greater than reputation. The mayor cut the ribbon. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and applause rippled through the crowd. The Veterans Center, once a dream, once nearly corrupted by arrogance, was alive. But Samuel Carter was nowhere to be seen. Emily scanned the crowd again, her heart sinking. He had vanished after the gala, slipping away without so much as a goodbye. For weeks she had wondered if he would return for this day. She needed to thank him. Then, just as the speeches ended and the first guests began to step inside, she saw him. At the edge of the crowd, dressed in the same tattered coat, stood Samuel. He leaned against a lamppost, his hat pulled low, his expression unreadable. He hadn't approached the stage, hadn't asked for recognition. He simply watched, as though content to see from afar. Emily's breath caught. Without thinking, she hurried through the crowd, her heels clicking against the pavement until she reached him. "You came," she whispered. Samuel lifted his gaze, those pale blue eyes as steady as ever. "I said I would." She swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to spill. "Everyone's been asking about you. You should be up there. This center exists because of you." Samuel shook his head slowly. "No. This center exists because people chose to change. Because hearts opened when they were tested. My name on a plaque means nothing. The work inside those walls, that means everything." Emily blinked back tears. "But you belong here. You deserve this." He smiled faintly, almost sadly. "I belonged once, long ago, but my part is finished. Yours is just beginning." Emily's throat tightened. She wanted to beg him to stay, to join the center, to keep guiding them. But something in his eyes told her the answer before she could speak. He was already halfway gone. She managed only a whisper. "Where will you go?" Samuel looked past her toward the horizon. "Wherever there is need, there are always people who've been forgotten. Perhaps I can remind a few more of them, and of those who should remember." The words settled like a final note at the end of a song. Emily wiped her cheeks and straightened. "Then promise me something." His brows lifted. "What's that?" "That you won't disappear completely. That someday when the world has forgotten again, you'll come back. Because we'll need you." For the first time, Samuel's smile reached his eyes. He tipped his hat. "If the music calls, I'll return." With that, he stepped away, blending into the moving crowd. Emily watched him go until he was nothing more than a shadow on the edge of the street. A part of her ached, but another part swelled with strength. Because he had given her more than a gift. He had given her purpose. Behind her, the doors of the Veterans Center swung open, and the first group of men and women walked inside, some with crutches, some with wheelchairs, some with quiet smiles of disbelief that such a place had finally been built for them. Emily turned back, her tears drying in the sunlight. She squared her shoulders and walked to the entrance, ready to welcome them home. The music of Samuel Carter lingered in her memory, a melody she knew she would carry forever. And though the Phantom Pianist had vanished once more, his song had left the city changed, not with wealth, not with power, but with compassion.